I'm Claire. I'm the manager of Lutyens and Rubinstein Bookshop in Notting Hill. This is the first of what I hope will be several interviews that we will be putting out on YouTube, highlighting exciting books that are just coming out or which may have come out in the past. My first guest, my trial guest, is Jackie Higgins, who has just written a book called Sentient, What Animals Reveal About Our Senses, which is due out on the 24th of this month, published by Picador. So thank you, Jackie.
Thank
for
you for having me. I feel
very
honoured. Very honoured. The first.
I know,
yeah.
And it's quite extraordinary because it's also, I think, the first science book that I have ever read.
Oh, Claire, that's brilliant to hear. But that was the aim. I really wanted to translate science to a big audience. So to kind of not make it scary and make it really easy to understand.
Absolutely. I mean, despite all these not all of them, but there are some unpronounceable words.
Yeah,
in
we'll
there.
forget about those.
But I have, since school, thought I was no good at science. I was always in art, and I found this book absolutely enthralling.
Thank you.
It's just a celebration of the animal world, which I love, but also of the human body,
yeah.
And what it's capable of.
Thank you.
So
that's great to hear.
What made you interested in this subject?
So I studied zoology, and I've always been interested in I've always been interested in zoology really as a mirror to understand ourselves. Mm-hmm. So the animal kingdom, we're one big family with the animal kingdom, and how they have evolved is completely echoed through our bodies, and how they behave and how they sense the world is also echoed through our bodies. Mm-hmm. So I think when I started making wildlife films, I did a degree in zoology, and then I made wildlife films and science documentaries for many years. But one of the first series that was out when I started was a series called Super Sense, which was this hugely successful BBC series, which was about the extraordinary ways in which animals sense the world, in ways that we couldn't possibly imagine. Mm-hmm. So when that came out, I was also, at that time, I was even fascinated about how we sense the world. What is it that these animals can teach us about the ways we sense the world? So it is, although it's a book about animals, essentially yes. It's a book about ourselves.
Yes.
It's about you and it's about me. And doing that enables us some distance. There's a Leonardo da Vinci quote I used at the beginning, this idea that we look without seeing, yes. We hear without listening, we smell, sense without noticing them. And I think by studying the animals and really studying how is it that they are hearing and smelling, that gives you a bit of distance to understand how we are doing it.
There's also a sense, isn't there, that we don't miss them, we don't notice them until they're gone.
Yes.
In a way, I was going to talk to you about the great grey owl.
Yes.
Because it was to do with hearing, and my sister has just, for whatever reason, just lost the hearing in one of her ears.
Right.
And so I was quite interested in this. And
yes.
But also it made me realise that she's not listening. Is it stereo?
Stereo.
Yes.
Yes. Oh, that's so. So again, talking about how similar the animal systems are to ourselves, the owl, and I chose this creature because, so the great grey owl is this extraordinarily huge owl that lives, it's also known as the Phantom of the North. It lives up in the northern forests around North America, Canada, and it's really big. I mean, it's got a wingspan a couple of meters across. But it's called Strix nebulosa. It's like mist, so it's camouflaged by its wings, but also it's silent when it comes to flying. And it does this extraordinary thing. You have these big mounds of snow, and from 30 meters away, and with a little vole buried 60 centimeters beneath the mound of snow, from 30 centimeters, so it can't smell them or see them. So what sense was it? And there was a huge amount of research into it. It hears them. So from 30 metres and buried by 60 centimetres of snow, it hears them. So it's got this exceptional sense of hearing. And talking of the similarities, their ears, and there's this great piece of video clip on YouTube that you can look up on the Teton Raptor Centre, where someone's holding a great grey owl and they peel apart the feathers of its facial ruff, and you can just, they don't have external ears like us, they have this hole. And you see the hole, the ear opening, and if you peer through, you can actually see the back of their eyeball. It's extraordinary, it's extraordinary. But if you look inside that opening, you find its inner ear. Yeah. And its inner ear is very similar to our inner ear. And the way that we hear sound is simply the vibration of molecules, and they hit our eardrum. So, and the way, and then excite these little hair cells inside. And when the hair cell moves, that's the sensor that converts vibration into electricity, and we get to hear what was moving. And that happens in the owl, and it happens in you, and it happens in your sister.
Yeah.
And then, but you were talking about
but
two
also that's what I found really interesting. I sort of messaged her saying, apparently, hearing loss can be due to the hair loss.
Yes.
In the ears.
In the ears, which is something. So we've only got 20,000 odd hairs in our ear in comparison to so many more sensors in our eyes. Or there's not very many sensors when it comes to hearing. So we do suffer from age-related hearing loss. As we get older, we get fewer cells. They don't regenerate. Now the extraordinary thing is the owl. They do regenerate. These hair cells do regenerate. And so scientists are looking right now at owl ears to understand how these little hair cells regenerate. And in doing so, they might be able to cure deafness.
Extraordinary.
So, yeah. But that's how similar we are to these creatures.
Yes. Yeah. Then I sort of wanted to talk to you about the star-nosed mole, which I didn't know about, but I did mention to Hannah, and she knew about it. I mean, the most extraordinary looking animal. I mean, what I found, again, and I was saying, is that, with an owl, you think perhaps it's eyesight, and you've uncovered that it's actually its earsight that is important. And with this particular mole, I would have thought, all moles use smell to capture their prey. Yeah. But in fact, this has this extraordinary appendage. Yeah.
A star.
A star.
Yeah. So it only fills a human hand. It's tiny. And its nose is essentially this 22-tipped star. And its nose is probably no bigger than my fingertip. And yet it's squeezed in all these little touch sensors into that tiny little space so that it's got the 6 times the sensitivity of my hand squeezed into that tiny fingertip. So it's the scientist who studied star-nosed moles, a chap called Ken Catania, would say, so it's just got this extraordinary, I mean, he would say that it's got the most touch-sensitive appendage known in mammals. I mean, it's just unbelievable. This tiny little creature. Yeah.
And I've never heard of it. And, again, the other thing I found in this bit that I sort of thought, why doesn't everybody know this, is that from this, because it has its sort of body imprinted on this star, doesn't it? Is that right?
So when they started looking at Ken Catania started looking at the brains, is when the story got really quite extraordinary. Yes. Because not only has it got all these sensors, but then when you trace the little nerve roots back to where what part of the brain is processing that information, you can see the whole outline of the mole on the surface of the mole's brain.
That's right. Yeah.
Except it's a slightly distorted outline of the mole. So, in fact, it's a massive star with a tiny mole in tow. And that's because huge amounts of space in the brain are dedicated to processing this touch information. Yeah. So the brain side of the sensory story is really intriguing. And these sensory maps we have too.
Yeah, that was what I found absolutely extraordinary, that on our brain.
On our brain. So there were these quite bonkers experiments that took place in the 1930s by Wilder Penfield at the Montreal Neurological Institute, and he was doing studies. We may have today heard of awake craniotomies, which is what Henry Marsh has done with patients, where he removes a part of the skull, and then while the patient's still conscious, removes, in order to they do this so that when they're probe is trying to kind of, excise the little bit of abnormality or figure out what's going on in the brain, they can make sure that the patient is still talking and still coherent, so you're not losing any good bits of the brain. So that's why Henry Marsh was doing it. Wilder Penfield was doing it, also for similar reasons, because he was working with epilepsy, but he found that when he had this kind of electric toothbrush kind of gadget that delivered very weak electric shocks. And when he delivered these weak electric shocks to the kind of pulsating brain while chatting to his patient, he would say, so what are you sensing now? And someone might say, ooh, I hear music. And then he'd move it over and they might say, ooh, I smell burnt toast. And then he found that there was this strip of brain, and it runs, if you put your earphones on your head, this strip of brain across the top of your head is where you process touch. And scientists call it the somatosensory cortex. And he found that when he was probing this little area on his patients' brains, different parts of their body would tingle. And by mapping which part of their body tingled, he found, again, like the mole, the outline of the person's body writ large, as it were, across their brain, but invisible. And again, like the mole, slightly distorted. So we've got this, he called it the little man, the homunculus in our head. And it's got enormous hands and enormous lips. Yeah. It's kind of slightly weird and misshapen. And scientists have now looked at humans have this little homunculus, the star-nosed molunculus and the racoonunculus and the platypusunculus. So all these creatures have we have these touch maps in our brain. And what's extraordinary, it's kind of point to point, so the bodies of the creature is on the brain.
No, absolutely extraordinary. And yet, to take that on, what I then found really interesting was the fact that, I always thought perhaps if you lost your sight or something, the part of the brain that would deal with that would sort of, just lie fallow or something.
Yes.
But the fact that the brain then, that part of the brain doesn't stop working, it just sort of uses its energy.
Yes.
To so you have better hearing, perhaps if you're blind, or you have better touch, and you talk about this extraordinary artist.
Yes.
Who uses touch to see.
Yes.
Do you want to tell us about him?
So Ezraf Armagan, and we met on Zoom. Sadly, we didn't meet in person, but we met on Zoom, and he's this amazing man who was born into one of the poorest neighbourhoods in Istanbul in the 1950s, and he was born completely blind, but he was really interested in drawing and painting, and he started drawing and painting when he was 5 years old. And as you say, he's convinced. So how he paints something is he takes my book, and he feels it, and by feeling it, he then takes a sharp object and makes an indentation of that object on a piece of paper, and then he goes over and he paints over where the tracing was. But he's got this extraordinary ability to take the 3 dimensions of this book and create a 2-dimensional representation of that book that you and I understand as it's a book.
Yes. Yeah.
So he's seeing it in 3 dimensions, as it were. Well, he's experiencing it and sensing in 3 dimensions and is able to visually show you this book. And he's never seen the book.
Yeah.
So he went to Harvard in 2004, and his brain was scanned. And he lay in this brain scanner, and the scientists passed him little objects to kind of feel, and he was lying, he said it was really difficult, he was lying down and having to draw these, he was given a little model of a man on a bench, and he had to draw the man on the bench. And then the scientists would say, can you actually draw that as if you were looking down on him? So his perspective and his ability was, the scientists were amazed.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, they were scanning his brain as he felt and then drew this object. And they were looking at the brain scans, and as you would expect, that strip of brain I was talking about, the somatosensory cortex, when he was feeling, this was activated, this lit up. And then when he was drawing, in addition to the touch area lighting up, his visual cortex, the part of the brain that lights up when you and I are looking at each other, the part of the brain that looks up when we're looking at, lights up when we're looking at the cup, lit up. And the scientist who I was chatting to, this chap called Alvaro Pascual Leon, said that if another doctor, a neurologist, had walked in and just looked at the scan without knowing who was in the scanner, they would have said, this person's seeing something. Of a blind man.
Yes.
So what happens, and Pascual Leon is really interested in working on this concept of neuroplasticity, this idea that experience can change the brain. So what's happened is that Ezref's experience of feeling, daily feeling, touching, feeling, has co-opted that space in the brain that would have been used for visual, if he had sight. But it's extraordinary.
Yes.
And Pascual Leon says that it actually could rewrite what we understand. We've always thought this part of the brain is the visual cortex, but maybe it's a part of the cortex that deals with the way that we understand dimension and shape. So when you don't have sight and you're not getting that stream of sight information to your brain, you're getting a stream of dimensional and shape information from your touch, and that's
what's
really going on.
Yeah, and the fact that they now realise that the brain is adapting all the time. It's not just
yes.
sort of fixed into this is the hearing, this is the sight, this is that it deals.
It's making use of whatever information it can get, and that was the other extraordinary experiment that he conducted. He took you and me, people with sight, and he blindfolded us, and they weren't allowed to lift their blindfold. They had to be completely. In fact, I think they put a little bit of photographic paper underneath the blindfold to double check they never lifted it. Yeah. So effectively, black blind for 5 days was the idea, and they taught them how to use their fingers and how to read Braille during this time, and then they scanned their brain to see if the brain was changing. It took 2 days for the brain to start changing, our brain to start changing, and then it took 5 days for that sighted person's touch sense to start using their visual cortex.
That's amazing.
So it's neuroplasticity happens all the time and quickly.
Yeah. It reacts to
what's going on.
Yeah. Oh, talk crazy. The other thing the other one that sort of turns the sort of preconceived wisdom on its head is there's the chapter on the giant peacock of the night, which deals with desire, which I thought was just fascinating. You call it the sort of the dark side to the sense of smell, and it sort of lends the lie rather to love at first sight. It becomes love at first smell.
Yeah.
I gather from this chapter.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
So the giant peacock of the night.
It's a moth, isn't it?
It's a moth, and it's a very big moth. It's the biggest European moth, and essentially the female releases a pheromone onto the air, which a male moth can pick up from miles away. I mean, they're part of a group of lepidopterans, some of the biggest insects in the world, and one of these moths could pick up the scent of. They found a male picking up the scent of a female from 5 miles away. I mean, it's extraordinary. Wow. It's like the OXO advert,
Yes.
except it's not visual. It's all, and you don't need. They're an example of you don't need a nose to smell. They're smelling with their antennae. So studies of moths like this moth, like the silk moth, led to the discovery of these extraordinary chemicals called pheromones, which we've all heard of, and some people's knowledge is a little bit shaky around. But essentially, pheromones have been found throughout the animal world, but they've yet to be proven. There are lots of studies into human pheromones, and the evidence is tantalising that we are adjusting who we want to take home for the night based on these pheromones. But there's still a lot of controversy as to whether these experiments are rock solid. And what scientists now think is they've got to do what the chap who first studied the moth did, which was identify this chemical, isolate it, then remake it, and then see whether the one they've made has the same effect.
Right.
And that would be the gold standard of proving whether these pheromones exist.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that said, the chapter then investigates how smell and all, needn't be pheromones, but smell does dictate who we find attractive, and the evidence on that is persuasive.
Yes. Well, yes. I mean, you talk about people in smelling T-shirts and all the rest of it.
Yes. So Klaus Wedekind did this study where he got men to kind of bathe and not wear spray, so basically trying to kind of make sure they had that clean odour and sleep in their T-shirts for a few nights. And then he asked women to smell these T-shirts, and he asked the women to rate the T-shirts as attractive. And he was interested in this because in mice this happens. So basically partnerships are formed between mice when they are using smell, when they have very different genes, part of this little cluster called the MHC cluster. Essentially it shapes your immune response to things. And the more different they are, the more likely partnerships happen. And this is what he had found in humans. The females found the men who had most attractive were those who had the most different kind of immune clusters, immune genes clusters. And so essentially what he's saying is, so it's different from pheromones, because here he's saying everyone's smell is unique, but it will always be attractive to someone.
Yes.
And if you mate and have babies with someone who's got a very different cluster of genes dictating their immunity, if they're very different, the idea being that you'll create these very robust and healthy babies with diverse immunity. So that's the idea, that it's a kind of, it's evolution's, kind of Cilla Black. It's blind date.
Yeah. Well, I was just surprised at how powerful a sense smell is. I mean, I think you were saying it goes directly to the amygdala?
The amygdala. Yeah. But it's the emotional centre of the brain.
Whereas the others sort of go via the cortex. And I mentioned earlier that we're reading Proust, and the big thing in Proust is this Madeleine, and it's the taste of the Madeleine. And you were talking about how smell and taste sort of combine to create flavour, but it is actually what we're smelling that gives things their flavour.
So maybe Proust, actually what he was saying, sorry, it's the flavour of a Madeleine.
Yes.
That makes him think of childhood.
Yes.
Because actually what we know of as taste is if you have a head cold and you eat that Madeleine, it tastes a little bit like mushy dough.
Yes.
In fact, the majority of flavour is all those little molecules that you've chewed up. They waft out the back of your mouth and up your nose, and you smell them. And so flavour hoodwinks us into thinking that it's been tasted on the tongue, but it's not. It's been registered up in our nose. Yeah. So I might argue that Proust's Madeleine, he was reacting to the smell of the Madeleine, or the combined, or rather more precisely, the combination of taste and smell, which is flavour.
Yeah. But also I think it's quite interesting because in fact he dips it in a sort of tea, a sort of herbal tea, tisane or whatever they're called. And so in fact it could well be the smell of that tea,
also,
but everyone always concentrates on the Madeleine.
Yes.
It's, sounds nicer than a cup of tea.
Cup of tea, yeah.
But I mean, all of that I found absolutely, astounding. So yes, and so I wanted to move on now to the senses that are quite sort of modern, I suppose, in comparison, and these are the ones that we're not conscious of. So our sense of direction, our sense of balance. I mean, it made me think of all the sort of senses we talk about: sense of humour, sense of fear, sense of unease. I mean, it's extraordinary. I imagine you could go on and on and on.
Yes.
But I found these really interesting, perhaps because we're not conscious of them all the time. So the first one is...
Can I just quickly say though also that one has to be careful with sense, because it's come to mean things beyond just sensing.
Right.
So sense of humour is not a sense in the sentient sense of the word.
Oh yes.
So,
don't see them
or sense
laughing
of
much.
poetry, or yes. Well. They might. I don't. I mean, this is more about the information that you're sensing from the world.
Oh, I see. So we misuse it.
So we
perhaps.
misuse it. We're very loose with the term. But there are a whole bunch of senses that most of us are using that we are unaware of. I mean, Aristotle was unaware of them. So he listed the 5 we know, you know, smelling, tasting, hearing, seeing, touching.
Yeah.
And but there are lots of senses that we're using all the time that are unfolding within us unconsciously, and we're unaware of using them. And that's what the second part of the book looks at.
Yes, and so you deal with the cheetah and balance, and I thought this was extraordinary. You write, even the slowest stroll is among the most daring balancing acts in the animal kingdom for humans.
Yes.
And it did make me think, you know, about the fact, yes, we are on these 2 quite small feet.
Yes.
And we're standing up.
Yes.
And we can dance and we can do yoga. And
yes.
I mean, I just thought it just makes you think about what we are capable
of doing. Yes.
And, you know, again,
I know these things we take for granted. This is a
Yes.
problem with the senses. We take a lot of this for granted. And so one has to unpick it to understand how wonderful it is, what miracles we are.
Yes, and it's, you know, yes, as I said before, it's, you know, not until you lose it that you recognise.
It's not
You
until
talk
you lose
about
it.
Oliver
Yeah.
Sacks, and that
Yeah.
gentleman comes to see him.
Yes.
Who is, I think you describe it as something, the Leaning Tower of Pisa.
Yes.
He describes
He's
it.
yes, he's been called the Leaning Tower of Pisa. He walks in at kind of at a tilt, and swears blind that he's not at a tilt. And Oliver Sacks realises that the only way to persuade this gentleman is to film him and show him the footage. And the guy then realises, oh my goodness, I'm walking at a tilt, but he didn't sense it.
But he could learn.
So he could learn the neuroplasticity that we are back to. The way he did it was he built himself a pair of Heath Robinson-like spectacles with a little pendulum, so that when he was walking around and he could see that the pendulum was swung, he realised that he was at a tilt, and he had to right himself in order to get the pendulum back. And I think by doing that over and over, adjusting himself, his body basically realigned itself.
Yeah. And you talk about balance with the cheetah, who, you know, everyone knows is perhaps, you know, most people know is the fastest animal on Earth. But in fact, that's not the significant thing when he's catching prey.
Yes.
The significant thing is his sense of balance, so that he can stop and catch, you know, exactly when he needs to, and manoeuvre, and that's all down
to this
to the head.
So you've got the cheetah in an outright race, the cheetah would probably outpace a gazelle, but the gazelle's tactic is they call it jinking. But essentially they're jumping, you know, you've seen them, you know, they're jumping all over. So the cheetah has to turn on a sixpence. This big creature has to turn on a sixpence and still keep his eyes. He's a gazelle-seeking missile. Still keep those eyes. And if you watch their heads in this slow-moving, the head is like a steady camera, absolutely rock steady. The same kind of a level above the ground, and it's not tipped or tilted. It's just, it's like a kind of still object. You know, we're doing kind of Scooby-Doo motion around, his body's doing, you know, crazy motion around it, but the skull is rock solid. And this scientist, Camille Grohe, decided to understand what was going on. So she scanned, she was working at the American Museum of Natural History at the time, and she scanned a whole bunch of cat skulls in order to look at their inner ear. So she looked at the inner ears of all these different cats, and she found that the cheetah was just completely different to all these other cats. It had an enlarged vestibular system. So the inner ear is the place where we hear, but it's also the place where we balance. And it had an enlarged vestibular system that enables it, that gives it this extraordinary balance.
Yeah. And then I found it was interesting because they looked at ballet dancers who, you know, renowned for pirouetting, you know, how many times.
Yes.
But still manage, and I've been doing ballet classes, and, you know, there's a lot of middle-aged women, and we do, you know, 3 pirouettes, and we're staggering around like drunken sailors or whatever.
Yes.
But they discovered, do you want to tell us about that
Yes.
experiment?
So this research took place in London, and Barry Seamungle, who ran it, he looks after a lot of patients who come in complaining of dizziness. So he's looking for ways to solve dizziness, or maybe, so he thought, well, ballerinas have to cope with immense amounts of dizziness. So what is it that their brain is doing that enables them to stop feeling dizzy? So they do this technique spotting, you've done the spotting, which stops the fluid building up in your vestibular system, the idea being that doesn't make them dizzy, it stops the swirl of fluid. But when he scanned their brains, he also found this part of the brain, which is like the gateway through which this vestibular information travels, was shrunk. So this is very different from Ezra F. Armagon, who's expanding his sense of touch to get the most out of feeling this book. The ballerinas, this part of the brain, the cerebellum, the grey matter in it, had shrunk. So they weren't listening to the balance information coming in, and that was stopping them from feeling dizzy. So Seamungle's theory with his dizzy patients is to get them, like the ballerinas, to practice day after day the movements, and in the hope that this also gets them to listen less to these dizzy signals.
Yeah, no, absolutely fascinating. So we haven't even talked about the Goliath catfish or the spookfish, but the last one I want to talk to was sort of everyone's favourite creature, I think, at the moment, and that was the common octopus.
Yeah.
But not just because of the octopus, because of, you talk about the sense of body, which again I found really fascinating, and sort of reading it, spent my time sort of
testing your sense of proprioception.
Yeah, absolutely, that's the word. And I mean, they are just extraordinary. I mean, tell us a bit about Inky.
Inky, it was an octopus, a New Zealand common octopus, who was a star attraction at the New Zealand National Aquarium, until one morning the keeper came in and found him gone. And it turned out, when they kind of did their detective work, that someone had left his tank, the lid of his tank, ajar, and they could see these kind of suckered tentacle little footprints or tentacle prints, leading up the tank, down the tank, and across the floor, and then to a pipe, 50 metres of which later he would get to the big blue beyond of the Pacific Ocean. So this little octopus still managed to kind of squeeze nature's Houdini. I mean, their bodies are all protein. They've got no skeleton. So I've seen videos online of these octopuses basically extruding themselves through the tiniest gaps, and they can do incredible things. They can unscrew the tops of jars from both outside and inside jars. They can undo those child-proof caps that bamboozle me.
Yeah.
They can. I mean, so I was attracted to the octopus. I mean, they recognise faces, all those lovely stories.
There've been a lot of studies and Netflix.
And the wonderful Netflix documentary, My Octopus Teacher. But this, I thought to think of the octopus from a different aspect, which I don't think anyone's particularly looked at, which is this idea of this sense of body. So it's got this protean body shape. So how on earth does it control this kind of unconstrained, 8-limbed figure? How does it do it? And the way we do it is through this sense that we all have, which most of us don't realise we have, and we don't realise we have until we lose it.
I mean, I did find it. I mean, it made me think. Sort of quite a long time ago, I fell at night through a trapdoor and hit my head on a fireplace. And when I woke up, I had the most extraordinary feeling that I couldn't feel my body.
Oh.
And I mean, I thought that I'd had this sort of, and then I thought, this can't be happening to me.
Yeah.
But it was like, I imagined, some sort of minute paralysis. It was it was there, but I couldn't do anything with it. And you talk about this extraordinary man, Ian Waterman, who does through a virus, I think, and his whole body sense is wiped out.
Has left him.
Do you want to tell us about?
So,
because you met him.
I met him.
Yeah.
He's the most incredible man. Properly inspirational and optimistic, and what he's well, I'll tell you his story. So when he was about 19, he was a butcher's assistant, young lad from Portsmouth, and he came down one day, was at the butcher's, and he didn't feel very well, and his boss said go home, and he went home. And he was coming down with some virus. He got some nasty fever. But his body began to misbehave in strange ways. He ended up in hospital. He fell asleep. He had these fevered dreams where he was floating above the mattress. He woke up with someone's hand on his face, only to realise it was his hand on his face. And then realised that he could not feel his body from his neck down. He couldn't feel his body. But I'm not talking about a kind of anaesthetic numbness.
No.
He had no idea where any part of it lay. He had no idea. He said it was as if he had been disembodied. So if we close our eyes, we know where our body is. We know where our body is to the point, as you say,
Yes.
that we can do this. So we've
Even
got
with
such
eyes
precision.
Yeah.
It's a sense we're not consciously aware of, but it's with us all the time, and it enables us to do that miraculous thing of walk. Every step forward is a balancing act. Proprioception is part of that story too, or our
Yes.
body sense is part of that story. So the doctors with Ian had no idea what was going on. They gave up on him. They sent him to a rehabilitation centre, and he was with such grit and determination, and that he would not be in a wheelchair for the rest of his life, or just lying on his parents' bed. He moved back into his parents' house, just staring up at the ceiling. He just, with such force of mind, just started figuring out how he could move his body again. And the story of doing this is humbling and inspirational, and many moving things. Gives me goosebumps.
Yeah.
He basically realised that by looking at the finger he wanted to move, he could, after huge amounts of practice, begin to get it to move. As soon as his eyes were turned, like Inky's limbs, it would go off and do something he wasn't aware of. But the moment he looked at it, he regained control. So he replaced his sense of body with vision by taking command again of his limbs, and basically he studied human motion, breaking it down to the most infinitesimal kind of components to rebuild it again. Simply to sit in a chair without being slouched, to stand, to walk, to appear natural, to walk as we walk. He relearned everything, but he has to look all the time at what he's doing. If the lights go out, he falls like a rag doll.
Or a sneeze, as you mentioned.
A sneeze, or he was watching fireworks, and that moment of black that you get after the bright light, he staggers. He talks about his daily marathon.
Yes.
I mean, everything requires such focus, such attention. And this, his experience shows what this sense is doing for us all the time without us having to think about it. His daily marathon is our ease.
Yeah.
So easy, we're not aware of it.
Yeah. I mean, I thought that was because I'd never heard of that. I mean, it's different to paralysis, isn't it? Is it different to
Well,
that? If somebody damages.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yes.
So yes. Jonathan Coleman, who was the neurologist who introduced me to Ian, who has been Ian's neurologist all the way through. He was an ex-student of Oliver Sacks and friend of Oliver Sacks, a really charming, lovely, generous chap at this time. He basically set about the first, the doctors had given up on Ian, but Jonathan set about the first study of Ian's body to work out what had gone wrong. And what they found were that the little proprioceptors, the little body sensors within his muscle, were still completely normal, but the nerves running from them to the brain were burnt, fried, essentially, by this virus. They'd wiped it out. And by the way, he's lost his sense of touch too. He can't feel. He can feel temperature and he can feel pain. He's kept those, but not the ability to,
Yes.
touch. Not what we generally understand as touch.
The texture or
The roughness of a
Yes.
walnut, the smoothness of a ball bearing, the discriminative touch.
Yeah.
So it's through, in answer to your question, it was through losing the nerve connection to the brain.
And was I right that this is quite a recent discovery, these receptors?
So
that I didn't quite realise, I mean, when I say recent, that we had them.
So what, the proprioceptors?
Yes.
No, that's not so
right,
recent.
okay.
The thing I was talking to you about, another angle of touch, another sense of touch. I mean, one of the things that really I was surprised by when I started to write this book were the number of stories that are very current. So a few decades ago, in our skin, someone discovered a little neuron in our skin. And over the past few decades, scientists have been trying to work out what this neuron does. And unlike normal touch cells, which we feel with our fingertips, as I was just saying, the smoothness, the roughness, these are not found in these hairless areas of our fingertips or palms of our hands or soles of our feet. They're found in the hairy parts. This little neuron's found in the hairy parts of our body. So that's one clue. The other clue is that scientists started kind of prodding and poking these hairy parts to work out what exactly is going to fire up that nerve. And they found three things together. One is the warmth of human body temperature, and a light pressure, and a movement of 3 to 5 centimetres. So we've got skin on skin, stroke, a caress. So it's become known as the cuddle sensor, the caress sensor, the head on the scepter. So this is a relatively new discovery. So that's in my book. That's the chapter on the vampire bat.
Yes.
And this idea that in addition to touching something and learning about it, there's a sense of being touched, the pleasure or the pain one gets from being touched. We've also got little sensors in our skin that detect pain,
Yes.
And sensors that detect the warmth of a cup of coffee or the coolness of a glass of water.
Yes.
These are all different sensors within our skin.
Yeah.
So our sense of touch now is fracturing into very many different. If you classify a sense according to the sensor, then we've got lots of different touch sensors.
Yes, because there is a condition, isn't there, where people lose that. And
Touch are touch blind.
And they burn themselves because they don't realise.
Yes.
Because they can't feel.
Yes.
Is that a real thing, pain? I know I read it in a novel.
Yes, no, and there are people so when the pain sensors go wrong, you can have gain of function, which is a very trendy word at the moment, isn't it? If you listen to Dominic Cummings.
Gainer or gainer?
Gain of function,
Oh, right.
and viruses and COVID. And
Oh, right,
anyway, forget that. But you can have, and again, when I talk about pain, I spoke to this lady, Pam Costa. It was during lockdown. I sadly couldn't meet up with her. She's over on the other side of the world in America. Her pain sensor is misfiring, and it's firing all the time. So she has this syndrome called Burning Man. She feels like she's on fire. And the flip of that was this cohort of people who were studied over in Lahore in Pakistan. There was a street performer out there who could do all these extraordinary things, like walk on hot coals, pierce his skin, and saw that he didn't feel a thing. Well, he didn't feel a thing.
Yeah.
And his wider family, scientists have said, the chap died, by the way, by doing something crazy like jumping off a roof, because essentially pain is our guardian angel, and it stops us from doing foolish things, or if we've done something, broken something, we know we've got to go to the doctor.
Yeah.
He had none of that. He has none of that. So he, the story goes, is that he jumped off a roof, and the injuries he sustained essentially killed him.
Yeah.
Anyway, yes. So pain is another sense that another of the touch senses that we are talking about.
It's all endlessly fascinating. So I do really want to know, Jackie, if God willing you won't, but if you were to lose a sense, which would be the most terrible to lose, do you think?
Such a difficult question.
Yeah. It's the deafness, blindness.
Yeah. Well, everyone does always talk about it. Most people would say blindness.
Although Helen Keller sort of mentions deafness, doesn't she?
So she's deaf and blind.
Yeah.
She was deaf and blind. I would say, I mean, I discovered, it was only through losing, I discovered all sorts of things that you could lose that I didn't realise you could lose.
Yes.
Like, you could be time blind, or body blind, or touch blind. And so I think not being able to touch and feel being touched, that would be the sense that I would most miss. So Frances McGlone, who is one of the scientists who I collaborated with on the book, is studying that caress sensor within the skin that they have relatively recently discovered. And he thinks that this touch sensor serves an even more important role, which is he thinks it's involved in building our sense of self. He thinks the roots of our self lie in our skin. Amazing.
Yeah.
It's where we discover, it gives us a boundary. We know this is me, and I know that that's you. He connects it to social aspects. It socializes the brain. It empathizes the brain. And he consequently talks about the pandemic that the lockdown that we've been through because of the pandemic, hopefully the end of that, but the extreme isolation and loneliness and the lack of touch that we've all experienced, but particularly the elderly, but maybe children from playing in playgrounds, this lack of touch that the human race has suffered, he thinks will have untold complications and manifestations in ways we've yet to comprehend.
Really fascinating.
So
Well, thank
touch.
you so much. And this beautiful book, Sentient, it's so beautiful. Isn't
I'm
it?
so
Absolutely
happy with what
lovely,
Picador have done.
with
Yeah.
all the amazing animals. It's out again on the 24th of June, published by Picador, as Jackie said. Will be available in store, signed copies.
Yes.
We hope. It will also be available through our website, www.lutchensandrubenstein.co.uk. Little prompt there. And also through bookshop.org, and I'm sure it'll be in all the very best bookshops throughout the land. And thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you all again
Thank you.
soon.
Yes, thank you, Claire, for giving
You're
me this
welcome.
opportunity. It's
Very
been
welcome.
great.
It's so amazing, and I'm going to have to keep